This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel fires back after Amnesty International slams Israel as an apartheid state. Plus, the historic visit of Israel's President Isaac Herzog to the United Arab Emirates is punctuated by an Iranian-backed rebel rocket attack. And an in-depth look at what an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program would look like. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. The international human rights group Amnesty International released a more than 200-page report labeling Israel as an apartheid state. But those reacting to the report say it basically says the Jewish state shouldn't exist. Israel is rejecting what it calls false allegations in the Amnesty report.
Instead of seeking the truth, Amnesty echoes the same lies shared by terrorist organizations. 5 minutes of serious examination would be enough to know that the so-called facts in the report published by Amnesty this week are delusional and disconnected from reality.
Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid charging that Amnesty doesn't call Syria, Iran, or other corrupt and murderous regimes apartheid states.
I hate to use the argument that if Israel wasn't a Jewish state, no one at Amnesty would dare make such a claim against it. But in this case, there's simply no other explanation.
The report is entitled Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, Cruel System of Domination and Crime Against Humanity. Amnesty's executive summary says Israel has established and maintained an institutionalized regime of oppression and domination of the Palestinian population for the benefit of Jewish Israelis, wherever it has exercised control over Palestinian lives since 1948. A Wall Street Journal editorial calls it, quote, a libel that distorts history. Israel was founded in the wake of the Holocaust with broad international support. The report is a denunciation of the very existence of Israel as a refuge for the Jewish people. Amnesty International says it's using the international definition of apartheid. But apartheid typically refers to the system of racial separation that gave white superiority over blacks in South Africa until the early 1990s. Israeli attorney Ian Hertzberg from the NGO Monitor says the report is aimed at questioning the legitimacy of Israel's existence.
The charge is powerful because it is an easy way to essentialize and exploit anti-Semitic tropes to transform the conflict into one of disputed lands and Arab rejection of Jewish presence in the Middle East to one of Jewish racism.
Israeli attorney David Benjamin grew up in South Africa. He says there's no comparison.
I was certainly a witness to the iniquities of that terrible system. And let me be absolutely clear, I've been living in Israel for the last 30-odd years, and there is absolutely nothing in common between the system of apartheid that applied in the old South Africa and the current situation in Israel.
Beyond Israel's borders, Iran continues to stir turmoil in the Middle East. A radical rebel group funded by the Islamic regime fired a rocket at a U.S. and Israeli ally in the region during an official visit by Israel's president. The rebels are based in nearby Yemen, and they say they'll continue to attack the United Arab Emirates as long as it's friendly with Israel. But leaders from those two nations say they won't be deterred by Iranian-backed aggression. The UAE says it destroyed a ballistic missile site in Yemen after shooting down a missile fired at their country by an Iranian-backed rebel group. The attack came during the historic visit of Israeli President Isaac Herzog to the UAE capital Abu Dhabi after the two nations signed an historic peace agreement in 2020.
We are two successful nations who basically started with very little in our hands, developed our lands into a successful paradise, and this sends a message to the entire region that there is an alternative for peace and living together, and that the sons and daughters of Abraham can reside and dwell together in peaceful coexistence.
Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed thanked Herzog for Israel's support after the two recent missile attacks by the Houthi rebels.
It's a stance that demonstrates our common view of the threats to regional stability and peace, particularly those posed by militias and terrorist forces, as well as our shared understanding of the importance of taking a firm stance against them.
Dr. Najat Al-Sayed of the American University in Dubai said the timing of the visit demonstrates that the new relationships between Israel and its Arab neighbors will stand up to threats by Iran's proxies in the region.
We're going to support the warm peace, which is the main kind of peace that kills the hostile and extremist ideologies.
Israeli Reserve Brigadier General Yossi Kupferwasser said it also comes in the context of the U.S. pulling back in the region and developments with Iran.
Coming to the UAE in a time like that, when the fate of the Iranian nuclear project is going to be determined, is very important for Israel, and to show that we are there together with the United Arab Emirates facing this radical threat. It's very important strategically.
The U.S. State Department condemned the attack. Spokesman Ned Price tweeting, while Israel's president is visiting the UAE to build bridges and promote stability across the region, the Houthis continue to launch attacks that threaten civilians. Meanwhile, the rebels threaten more attacks.
The Yemeni armed forces confirmed that the UAE enemy state will remain unsafe as long as the tools of the Israeli enemy remain in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, launching aggression against our dear country.
In another sign of the growing military cooperation between Israel and its Abraham Accord partners, Israel's Defense Minister, Benny Gantz, paid an historic visit to Bahrain. Gantz met with Bahrain's king and also signed a memorandum of cooperation with Bahrain's Minister of Defense. The signing comes 1 year after the Abraham Accords, and Gantz says it will strengthen both countries in the face of emerging threats in the region. And as we said, one of those threats is the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen. Their attacks on the UAE are a sign this group has emerged as a major player in the Middle East. For years, the Houthis have waged a guerrilla war to control the strategic country of Yemen. But now they've grown from small arms to long-range missiles.
The Houthis, backed by the Iranians, have really been put on steroids in terms of their abilities. This is a militia that was using AK-47s and RPGs back in those days. Now they're using drones and ballistic missiles that can go, 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers. So it's clear that the Iranian hand is basically using them as a proxy to terrorize, the region and potentially threaten Israel, the United States, all over this area.
Yemen sits at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. If they control Yemen, the Houthis will also control the strategic Mandobab waterway, where a large amount of the world's oil passes. They also pose a serious threat to their Arab neighbors. The Houthi missiles traveled nearly 900 miles before hitting their targets in the UAE. This satellite image shows the damage. And after the attack, the Houthis boasted about attacking the American allies. And they sent a message to both Israel and the UAE by launching missiles during the historic visit by Israeli President Isaac Herzog. Seth Fransman of the Middle East Center for Reporting and Analysis says this group has now become a major player in the region.
We are certainly entering a bit of a new era in terms of the fact that the Iranian-backed group in Yemen is now a big player and will look to become another type of Hezbollah. And that will have big ramifications for the United States, for Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf, and all these partners and potentially international trade.
Some fear it could be a dangerous turning point for the Middle East. Yet last year, the Biden administration took the Houthis off the list of foreign terrorist organizations, a move criticized by the UAE ambassador to the U.S.
And just for everyone's sort of transparency here, we are asking our friends in the administration and in Congress to reinstate the Houthi terrorist designation as an FTO. I think the case speaks for itself.
Some believe the Biden administration took the Houthis off the list to curry favor with Iran at the nuclear talks. But Fransman says in the larger Middle East picture, the region faces two visions for the future.
One wants a Middle East that is taken over by a bunch of Iranian-style mafias that are impoverishing the region and spreading chaos and religious extremism. And the other one is a model that is, what you see when you go to Tel Aviv or Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Jerusalem. You see cities that are functioning and people that are able to go to school and university and improve the world. So I think it's basically two diametric, different types of visions.
Up next, it's been talked about for years. What would an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program look like? Israeli leaders insist they will not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. For years, the overshadowing question has been whether Israel would take preemptive action to cripple or destroy the regime's nuclear program. CBN News talked with one Israeli analyst who has studied the question for more than a decade. In 2012, Yaakov Katz, now the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, served as the paper's defense analyst. As co-author of Israel versus Iran, The Shadow War, he examined the potential for an attack on Iran's nuclear program.
It seemed at the time that Israel was capable of doing it. I distinctly remember one meeting that I was brought into at the Air Force headquarters in Tel Aviv with the top Air Force general who basically rolled out a map on a table and showed us how the Israeli Air Force squadrons would fly to Iran.
At the time, Israel prepared night and day.
The Air Force had been training extensively for this operation. Billions and billions of shekels had been poured in to this planning and to training and to buying up the munitions and the technology and the weapons that would be needed to take out some of the facilities.
Then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Ehud Barak tried but failed to convince the cabinet, army and security chiefs to take action.
In the end, that never happened. So that was the backdrop back in 2012. And it seemed real, it seemed viable, and it seemed like Israel had a real opportunity to cause enough damage to set back Iran's nuclear program.
Now, 10 years later, the problem and targets remain the same. Natanz, Iran's main uranium enrichment facility. Fordow, with thousands of centrifuges burrowed into a mountain. To the west, Iraq, where a heavy water plutonium facility is under construction. And further south, Iran's uranium conversion facility in Isfahan. Since this scenario hasn't changed in 10 years, what about Israel's military capability?
Israel today, Chris, is stronger than it was back in 2012, right? If back in 2012 we had F-15s and F-16s, those are fourth generation fighter jets that are detectable on radar. Today we have F-35s. These are the JSF, the Joint Strike Fighters, that have stealth flight capabilities that can basically go fly into enemy airspace, not be detected, and can take out radar installations as well as surface-to-air missile systems, can basically pave the way for then the big heavy bombers, the F-15s and the F-16s, to come in and drop a ton of munitions all over these different facilities to destroy them.
The question a lot of people have been asking over and over again throughout the years, can Israel do it?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated today, Chris. I think that back in 2012, the feeling was that, yes, it could do it. Then Iran's nuclear program is not as advanced as it is today. It was not as heavily fortified as it is today. It was not as dispersed as it is today. With that said, even then, it would have been just causing enough damage to set them back for a period of time.
Middle East expert Joel Rosenberg laid out a number of top stories to look at in 2022. At the top of the list, an Israeli attack on Iran.
We've never had to do it before. We've always found a way through covert operations and all kinds of other shadow activities to keep Iran from getting the bomb without having to go to what's called a kinetic war, a full-on actual war.
Katz points out even if there were an attack, it wouldn't be the end of the story.
And I think that no one has any illusion to believe that if Israel attacks Iran, that's it. There's never going to be a nuclear program. No, there can be, because the Iranians have the domestic know-how, they have the technology, it's in their heads. And while you can destroy their facilities and infrastructure, you can't take away that knowledge.
Plus, any military move likely leads to a regional war, with Iran unleashing Hezbollah, its arm in Lebanon, to fire thousands of missiles into Israel.
That is not a war we want to be in. We might have to do it, but I mean, those stakes are just so high, and I think that's the far away the biggest story.
I think that Israel has means at its disposal. The question, though, comes down to, is it worth it? Is the damage that you will cause Iran's nuclear infrastructure going to be worth the war that will ensue, the international condemnations that you will almost definitely face from the world?
It's an age-old dilemma that now faces a new set of Israeli leaders.
I don't think Israel can live with a nuclear Iran, right? I think a nuclear Iran has the potential to pose an existential threat to the state of Israel. So it's not like I'm saying we should just sit back and let this happen. No, we have to do what we have to do, but we also have to realize that sometimes power has its limits. So it's complicated.
As Israeli military and political leaders increasingly warn about a looming attack, Rosenberg believes Israel's options are running out.
I don't hear it as hyperbolic. I don't hear it as trying to, be sensationalistic. I think Israeli leaders are realizing this is it. Iran has gone past all of the previous red lines that any Israeli government has ever said. But no Israeli prime minister wants to go to war.
The threat, sadly, is still there, and it needs to be dealt with. I would hope and pray that it can be dealt without the use of force, without the need for war and bloodshed. That is always the Israeli and Jewish preference, right? Is to be able to do this through peaceful means, through dialogue, through discussion, through a deal. But unfortunately, we are dealing with a murderous regime that has so much blood on its hands that it's only seeking and hungry for more. And that's why it needs to be stopped.
And another part of history also remains, as Katz points out, often the Jewish people stand alone.
That famous saying of Hillel the Elder, a Jewish scholar from the period of the Talmud from a couple thousand years ago, who said back in the time in Hebrew, "Eina nidli mili," which translates into English, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And what was true thousands of years ago for the Jewish people is still so true in the year 2022.
Coming up, a first-hand account of how Jews in Ukraine are doing under the looming threat of a Russian invasion. With well over 100,000 Russian troops on its border, the Ukraine is asking Israel for help with air and cyber defenses. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are bracing for an invasion. Estimates vary, but at least 70,000 Jews live within Ukraine. And Yael Eckstein of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews just returned from a visit to the country. CBN's Julie Stahl talked with Eckstein about the situation for the Jewish people of Ukraine.
We're hearing a lot about what's going on in the Ukraine right now. Can you tell us what the situation is for the Jewish people there?
Well, people are often very surprised to hear that there are over 200,000 Jewish people still in Ukraine. As the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews has been active for over 30 years with providing food for the hungry, clothing for the naked, helping the elderly and the orphans with their basic biblical needs, just as we're instructed to from God. We continue during times of peace, during times of war, and we're not affected by nor involved in any of the politics around it.
Are they thinking that they would like to come out?
One of our programs is our Aliyah program on Wings of Eagles, where we've been bringing Jews from the former Soviet Union home to Israel, just as the prophets foresaw, that one day from all four corners of the earth, they would be returned to their land. And so the fellowship is there on the ground, helping those who are able to make Aliyah, who want to make Aliyah, come to Israel. In fact, just last week, we had 3 Aliyah flights in 1 week. So we're continuing our operations, rain or shine, no matter what's going on. And there are those who have always dreamed about making Aliyah and are jumping on this time now to move to Israel, and others that for whatever reason are not able to. And so we're there on the ground helping them as well. I was just in Ukraine on the ground 2 days ago, where I visited the synagogues and the schools, and I saw all the security, and I felt all of the unknown of what will be in the future there. But what was very clear to me is that there's a thriving and strong Jewish community in Ukraine that isn't going anywhere so quickly.
And what do you think their greatest need is right now?
Right now, the price of fuel has increased over 800% in the past year. And so what I saw is I went to different homes and I visited an orphanage and I visited elderly centers and individual people's homes, was that right now heating, it's the middle of winter. There's a ton of snow. It's freezing temperatures. Right now, the need for heat, I would say, is overall for people who even were able to get by beforehand. There are so many people who live in really abstract poverty there on the $75 a month government stipend that they receive, the elderly, that it's European prices. You can't buy anything with that.
That's really rough. And they have nowhere to turn to.
It's really the love of Christians and Jews around the world who are on the ground, boots on the ground, in practice, bringing these people who don't even know where to turn to, coming with just hope and life.
Up next, Yad Vashem extends an invitation to Whoopi Goldberg after her controversial comments about the Holocaust. ABC suspended actress and commentator Whoopi Goldberg from the TV program The View after her comments that the Holocaust was not about race, but about man's inhumanity to man. In the wake of her comments, Danny Dayan, the chairman of Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial, invited Goldberg to the Remembrance Center here in Jerusalem.
The words of Ms. Goldberg show a fundamental misunderstanding of what is anti-Semitism in general and the Holocaust in particular. I call upon Ms. Goldberg and other influencers to come to Yad Vashem to help us educate them and others, they as influencers and their audiences, to really what is anti-Semitism, was to the Holocaust.
Well, hopefully Goldberg and others will accept Dayan's invitation. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.